What if one of the greatest spiritual teachers has been quietly speaking to us all along? Not through words, not through sacred text, but through the living world itself. Throughout history, human beings have looked to nature for survival. We've studied its seasons, learned its rhythms, built our civilizations around its cycles. And yet, perhaps we've overlooked something. Nature doesn't seem nearly as interested in staying the same as we are. Forests burn, rivers overflow, trees shed their leaves, flowers disappear beneath the snow. Entire landscapes seem to come to an end. And then, somehow, life begins again. A forest burns, smoke fills the sky, trees that have stood for centuries collapse, animals flee. The landscape is black. If you arrived that day, you'd probably think the forest was gone forever. But nature seems to have a different idea. Throughout history, people have offered many explanations for why the natural world seems so remarkably resilient. Some point to biology, others to ecology. Others simply see the remarkable adaptability of life itself. And still others wonder whether nature might reveal something deeper about the structure of reality. Whether any of those explanations are correct isn't the question that we're exploring today. Instead, I'd like to do something much simpler. I'd like to walk through a few stories the natural world has been quietly telling and simply observe. Because something interesting begins to happen when we stop seeing endings as the opposite of life and begin asking why life so often seems to move through them. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to explore 5 moments where nature appears to transform apparent endings into unexpected beginnings. Not to argue that nature is trying to teach us anything, and not to claim that every ending is somehow good, but to ask a question I don't think we ask often enough. Why does nature seem so remarkably unwilling to give up? You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice. And not to conclude, but to understand. And perhaps that's where the first pattern begins to emerge. Because when most of us see fire, we see an ending. Nature often seems to see something else. For much of the 20th century, people believed that every forest fire should be extinguished as quickly as possible. Fire was seen as the enemy, something to be prevented, something to be eliminated. That seemed like the obvious thing to do, until something unexpected happened. In the giant sequoia groves of California, scientists began noticing that almost no young sequoias were growing. The ancient trees were still standing, but very few new ones were taking their place. Eventually, researchers discovered something remarkable. Giant sequoias had never depended on the absence of fire. They had depended on its presence. The heat from naturally occurring fires helped open their cones. Fire cleared away dense undergrowth that blocked sunlight from reaching young seedlings. Ash returned nutrients to the soil. What looked like destruction had quietly been making renewal possible all along. Ironically, it wasn't the fire that interrupted the cycle, it was our attempt to prevent it. Different story, different question, but another remarkably familiar pattern begins to appear. Sometimes the very thing we believe is destroying life is also creating the conditions that allow new life to emerge, which raises an interesting question. Why does nature seem so willing to move through disruption instead of spending all its energy trying to avoid it? Perhaps nature understands something we've forgotten, that not every ending is a failure, and not every loss is meaningless, and not every fire exists simply to destroy. That doesn't mean fire is pleasant or that loss isn't real. The forest still burns, trees still fall, life is still changed. But somehow, nature keeps responding with renewal. And perhaps that's the first lesson quietly waiting beneath the surface. Nature doesn't seem nearly as interested in preserving the moment as it is in preserving itself. And perhaps that's where the next pattern begins to emerge, because not every renewal begins with a catastrophe. Sometimes it begins with a release. Every autumn, forests across the world begin letting go. Leaves that have spent an entire season gathering sunlight begin to change color. Then, one by one, they fall. If we didn't know better, we might think the trees were dying. But something quieter is happening. Deciduous trees aren't losing their leaves because they're failing. They're preparing. As winter approaches, the tree begins conserving water and energy. The leaves that once sustained it become a liability in the months ahead. Letting them go isn't the opposite of life. It's one of the ways that life continues. A remarkably similar pattern appears in vineyards. For thousands of years, growers have understood something that nature had been quietly demonstrating all along. Each year, they intentionally prune healthy grapevines. They remove branches that are still alive, still growing, still producing leaves. At first glance, it seems wasteful. Why cut away something that's healthy? But experienced growers understand something that isn't immediately obvious. Left alone, the vine eventually begins to spend more energy maintaining unnecessary growth than protecting its fruit. Sometimes less growth produces more life. Careful pruning doesn't diminish the vine, it strengthens it. Different stories, different landscapes, and yet another remarkably familiar pattern begins to appear. Nature doesn't seem to cling to every season. It releases one, so another can begin. Which raises another interesting question. Why does nature seem so willing to let go, while human beings often struggle to do the same? Perhaps nature doesn't seem interested in preserving every expression of life. It seems committed to preserving life itself. The tree does not cling to every leaf. The vine does not resist every cut. They simply continue participating in the rhythm that sustains them. That doesn't mean the loss is painless. Winter is still winter. Pruning is still pruning. But somehow, release becomes part of renewal. And perhaps that's another quiet observation the natural world has been making all along. Life doesn't always grow by holding on. Sometimes it grows by knowing what to let go. And perhaps that's where another pattern quietly begins to emerge. Because not every renewal happens immediately. Sometimes it waits. For thousands of years, the people of ancient Egypt watched the Nile overflow its banks. Entire fields disappeared beneath the water. At first glance, it looked like destruction. Crops were submerged. The familiar landscape vanished. And yet, when the waters receded, they left behind something unexpected: rich layers of fertile silt. The very flood that appeared to take life away helped prepare the ground for new life to grow. The struggle wasn't separate from the renewal. It became part of it. A remarkably similar story unfolds in some of the driest places on Earth. Desert wildflower seeds can remain dormant beneath the soil for years, sometimes decades. They aren't dead. They aren't failing. They're waiting. Then, after just the right rain, entire landscapes burst into color almost overnight. Flowers that seemed impossible only days before suddenly blanket the desert. Different landscapes, different rhythms, and yet another remarkably familiar pattern begins to appear. Nature doesn't seem to confuse waiting with failure, which raises another interesting question. Why do we so often assume that nothing is happening simply because we can't yet see the change? Perhaps renewal isn't always visible while it's taking place. Sometimes rivers are enriching the soil beneath the surface. Sometimes seeds are quietly preparing beneath the ground. Sometimes what appears to be stillness is simply life gathering itself for what comes next. That doesn't make waiting easy. Floods still overwhelm. Dry seasons still feel endless. But somehow, nature keeps reminding us that unseen doesn't necessarily mean unfinished. And perhaps that's another quiet observation the natural world has been making all along. Some of life's deepest restorations begin long before they're visible. So where does that leave us? Potentially exactly where we began. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. We've watched forests recover after fire, trees release their leaves before winter, vines become stronger through pruning, rivers nourish the ground through flooding, and seeds wait patiently beneath the soil until the conditions are right. Different landscapes, different rhythms, and yet they all seem to participate in a remarkably similar movement: transformation, renewal, restoration. Perhaps that's why nature has always fascinated us. Not simply because it's beautiful, but because it continually demonstrates that endings are rarely the whole story. If renewal appears throughout forests, through seasons, through rivers, through ecosystems, through living things themselves, then perhaps the most interesting question isn't whether renewal exists. We can watch it happening all around us. Perhaps the more interesting question is why? Why does life seem so remarkably unwilling to stop beginning again? Some people see nothing more than biology. Others see elegant ecological systems. Others see evidence of deeper principles woven into reality. Others see the fingerprints of a creator. Whether any of these explanations are correct isn't something we're trying to settle today. But perhaps they're all responding to the same observation. Life seems astonishingly committed to restoration. And perhaps that's why the natural world has captivated humanity's imagination for as long as we've been telling stories. It quietly reminds us again and again that change isn't always the opposite of life. Sometimes it's the way life continues. Perhaps renewal isn't nature's exception. Perhaps it's nature's language. And if that's true, even in part, then perhaps it's worth asking what the living world has been quietly inviting us to notice all along, and how we see renewal in reality. But that's a journey we'll continue next time. Come back and we will talk a little bit more about how cycles and renewal apply to the human world. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. I'll see you next week.